This is Andy. Andy has a problem. Yesterday, Professor Awesome assigned Andy a paper. But this is not just any old paper. Andy can handle any old papers. In fact, he is excellent at writing any old papers. Andy can enter the library at 8 o'clock after a leisurely dinner and a glass of wine, and by midnight he is pulling his A-plus paper off of the printer. This paper is different. Professor Awesome has assigned Andy a paper that is, well, not so awesome. It's not the content that isn't awesome. It's not even the length that isn't awesome. The thing that is very unawesome about the paper that Professor Awesome has assigned Andy to write is that he cannot use a computer. Not only is Andy not allowed to use the computer to type his paper, but he is also not allowed to use it for research, to ask questions, or even to procrastinate. Let's watch how Andy handled this awesome task. Andy arrived at the library Saturday morning at 7 o'clock. Knowing that he needed to start out the old-fashioned way, he headed straight towards where he thought the card catalogs might be, and was thrilled to see that they still existed. As Andy had not used a card catalog since 5th grade, it took him 30 minutes to relearn how it was organized. After several thoughts of flushing the cards down the toilet, Andy found the right section and set off to find some real books. When he arrived at the PS 456 through 600 row, Andy was confronted with something he never could have anticipated. There were too many books on his topic. How was it possible that so much information existed so easily before him? Confused, he began paging through the books and piling them into his arms before setting off determinedly towards the desk that would become his hovel for the next 12 hours. The next 4 hours did not go well for Andy. Overwhelmed by the amount of unorganized information before him, he spent 15 minutes staring at each book before opening it and starting to take notes. He kept wandering around the library, hoping a bit of walking and exploration would invigorate him and give him the energy and inspiration he needed to continue. Things went on like this for quite some time, interrupted only by snacks and power naps and occasional newspaper breaks that Andy told himself were definitely legitimate things he needed to do. Once, on a short jaunt to the bathroom, Andy spent 3 minutes staring longingly at the computer and imagining the important updates he was missing on Facebook at that very moment. Despite these distractions, by noon Andy felt that he was nearing the end of the note-taking phase. He took a break to watch his friends play frisbee outside on the library lawn, momentarily considered starting an outline, and then returned to the window. By 1, Andy was back at work. As he developed his ideas and information, Andy hit a bump in the road of paper writing. He had no idea where his argument was going. Andy needed the guidance of Professor Awesome. There was only one problem. It was Saturday, and that meant Professor Awesome would not be in his office. Email obviously was not an option. Andy tried to remember if he knew where Professor Awesome lived. Nope. And he definitely didn't have a cell number. And then Andy had a brilliant idea. Maybe, just maybe, Professor Awesome had a landline in his house. Andy borrowed a phone book and scanned the A's for Awesome. He was in luck. He dialed the number and caught Professor Awesome right before his afternoon nap. They discussed the intricacies of Andy's argument, and after 15 minutes of very deep thought involving much hand gesturing on Andy's part, the confusion was resolved, and Andy was ready to begin writing on his first draft. For 3 straight hours, Andy wrote and 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 wrote, and he also wrote. His hand cramped, his pen snapped and spilled ink all over his masterpiece, and he had to pee at least 10 times from the amount of coffee he was ingesting. But Andy persevered. When it was all said and done, Andy had 3 handwritten pages, exactly the length Professor Awesome had specified. But there was yet another problem. Professor Awesome had clearly requested that the paper be completely legible. Andy, looking back through his paper, was sure his did not meet this qualification. He was going to have to write it once again. By this time, Andy's hand was utterly exhausted. He had blisters, and the tiny bones and muscles ached. He tried massaging it, icing it, and soaking it in hot water. 2 hours and 3 band-aids later, Andy began the delicate process of copying his paper. He tried to block out the pain by fantasizing about what kinds of emails would be waiting for him in his inbox and the pictures that Beth, the girl he danced with the night before, had posted on her Facebook. Finally, by 8 p.m., Andy was done with his paper. He packed up his notebooks, put the books back on the shelf, and proceeded home to don his Halloween costume and head out for the night of his life.